with that, help me welcome Gopasani from UTC.
Thank you, Al. Thank you. Well, I really want to appreciate you and tell you how grateful I am to be invited here, but also for that segue in, because it's really going to be relevant, I hope, to the discussion. I'll get into myself a little bit, why I should be up here talking to you all about leadership. You're all leaders in your own right, and you're like, why me? But I want to ask you all a couple of questions first off. And the first one is, and this isn't a trick question, there's no right answer. You have an answer, everybody has one, but why is leadership important in your organization? What does it mean? The first thing you start to think about, why leadership matters. Vision? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Vision, direction, sort of strategy, where are we headed, that kind of thing. Growth? Yeah, for sure, right? Going to lead the direction? I'm sorry? Culture. Absolutely, for sure. I just worked with a CEO and I told him, I'm changing your title to Chief Culture Officer because that's really what you are. You're a culture driver in this organization, for sure. Any other thoughts?
Inspiration.
Yeah, inspiration. You bet. Stability. Yep, absolutely. Setting a course, holding it, keeping, predictability, the ability, human beings need that stability for sure. Interesting, decision making. Yeah, today that's true. But we're going to talk a little bit about how that may not necessarily be so true in the coming decades, but absolutely decision making. And we'll talk about heroic leadership and the idea of the leader that stands out front, hands on hips and points and says, go that way, do that thing, and everybody goes, yes, I'm going to do that. And the nature of changing heroic leadership. What else? Any others? Those are all really good things. So I'm going to tell you my background. I spent 28 years in the Army, and I got a couple of pictures to prove it. I commanded everything in the Army from a 40-person platoon up to a almost 5,000-person combat brigade. I commanded the largest combat aviation brigade in the Army. I had soldiers in 4 countries, combat, peacetime. I've been to combat in 3 different wars, and I was an Apache pilot. And that's me sitting on Saddam Hussein's throne in Al Faw Palace, which a friend of mine called that the tourist photo, because everybody that goes there afterward takes that picture, and I just couldn't resist doing it. But at any rate. So I spent 28 years in the Army as a practitioner and a student of leadership. The Army sent me to grad school a couple of times. I got advanced degrees in communication, strategy. I spent time studying networks, communicating. I was a strategist for the Department of Defense when I wasn't doing that work. I built war plans. I built enterprise plans. And then when I retired, I went into banking, because it's what you do, right? It's a perfect transition. I became a senior vice president for a commercial bank out of Philadelphia. I did mergers and acquisitions and strategy development for the organization. I loved the work. I enjoyed banking. But I had this burning desire to do something more. And I saw over and over again the challenges in corporate America that were the same challenges that I dealt with in the military. And is, how do you transform an organization that is largely successful? Right? Which is really hard, because when you fail, after Vietnam, the Army transformed because it had failed. And it was pretty easy to look back and say, we didn't do something right. Some really bad things happened. We probably need to change. But when you're successful, how do you do that? Right? When everything tells you that you've got it right, how do you transform your organization? Even if you know in your mind that the world is changing and you've got to do things differently, you still believe that you got it right. And so changing an organization that is successful is really difficult. So that's what I kind of did. I left the banking world, and for the last 4 years, I've been engaged in working with companies on transforming. And it's mostly about culture and leadership. There's also process involved, and there's a lot of communicating involved, and there's communicating at scale, and there's some technology involved, right? We build knowledge centers for folks and stuff like that. But I'm not here to talk about my company. What I'm here to do, though, is talk to you about why I'm talking to you about this and why this matters, okay? And so what I want to talk to you about is the 4th industrial revolution. You've heard it. If somebody asked who knows what it is, and only like one or two people raised their hands. We're going to walk through the industrial revolution and the theory behind it and the background just to get you up to speed, because you don't know where you're supposed to go until you know where you've been, right? So how did we get to the kind of leaders that we have today? But the fourth industrial revolution, which is what we're in the midst of now, which is the emergence of robotics and AI and the ability to take the virtual and the physical and merge them, as well as the biological. We can do things today that we could never do, that were impossible to do throughout our human history. We can take things from the physical space, we can digitize them and bring them into the virtual space, we can manipulate them, and we can recreate them in the physical space again, different. Think about 3D printing, right? You can take a picture of something, you can bring it into a virtual environment, you can manipulate it, you can then print it, and you now have a thing that didn't exist before. And you can do that in your own home, by the way, right? So you all know this, and you're on the forefront, you're leading in this world, right? But it's changing the way that we're going to have to lead in the world, because literally and figuratively and actually, the world has changed. So here's the theory of the case. Technology is becoming a commodity. Everyone has it. We're all cybernetic organisms today, by the way. Who in here does not have a cell phone? Who in here would think of leaving their house without it? Who in here, when you can't find your phone, freaks out? You are actually now biological and technological at the same time. It's just not implanted into you, but that's coming, right? Technology is a commodity, but it's unleashing creativity. How many of you know what Ring is? You know the doorbell thing, Ring? Jamie Simonoff? Okay, Jamie was basically brought into production by a company that I work for, that one of my clients. Jamie created this doorbell. He's not an engineer. He's not a designer. He's a tinkerer. And he was sitting in his house, in the shed, in the far back of his yard, tinkering and building stuff. And the doorbell would ring and people would leave packages, but they wouldn't leave the package because nobody would answer the doorbell because there was nobody there, and his wife worked out of the house during the day. So Jamie created a door bot that could have a camera, and when someone rang the doorbell, he could see and he could talk to them and say, leave the package on the steps. Right? So that's how he created Ring. And when he went to sell it, he went with a company that said, we can give you engineers to fix that and help you design it. And we can help you get into prototyping and scale and production. And we can do all of these things. And he didn't have any of that. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have the capital. He didn't have a manufacturing background. And yet he just sold the company to Amazon for $1 billion. That's what technology, that's the commoditization of technology. It's happened today. And it's democratizing creativity. The other thing is efficiency and functional expertise are no longer distinct competitive advantages. They're table stakes. You can't be a company today without being efficient and without having functional expertise. So what? Everybody's got that. Now you have to provide something else in the marketplace to differentiate yourself. As a leader, we grow up because we're functional experts. Again, the heroic leader. I grew up in this company. I can do everything in this company that can be done, from production to manufacturing to marketing to design, distribution, supply chain. The problem is it's becoming way too complex for any one person to be that good. And by the way, by the time you get to senior executive leadership, the skills that you have are outdated. So your functional expertise doesn't really matter anymore. Think of most of the CEOs of most of the Fortune 500 companies today, they're financiers. They're not operations people. Chip Berg at Levi is a different story. Grew up in 20-some-odd years in Procter & Gamble. He's an operations guy, and you can tell because of what he's doing at Levi. But most companies today are run by CFOs and financiers. It's a balance sheet operation. And the companies are too complex for any one person to be in charge and to understand how everything works. Doesn't mean you don't have to touch it. Doesn't mean you don't have to be engaged with it. But you've heard of the idea of reverse mentoring? Anybody not heard of it? It's the idea that young people who come in now have really strong functional skills, and you may, as a senior leader, take time to sit down with them on a regular basis and have them mentor you on how it works today. Because you have wisdom that's born of experience, but they have functional expertise. And it's so that's that leader that now has to have the idea to understand, I have to learn to have the humility to be able to sit down with a young person who's a functional technical expert so that I can stay abreast of what's going on in my own company. So the soft leadership skills are going to replace those. And there's another reason why that's going to happen, and we'll talk about it when we get into the idea of AI. So I'm going to give you a quote. I can't give you the attribution because I didn't ask her if I could use it, but she's a client. She's the chief strategy officer for one of our companies, and she's been voted one of the 50 most powerful women in technology for the last 5 years. And this is a quote from her. The democratization of technology. You no longer have to be an engineer to build things. You no longer have to be a supply chain expert or even own a supply chain because you can go out and buy it. There is now a democratization of technology that is changing things, and to me, that is the secret sauce of the change that's happening, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. It's really going to be in the future of the Industrial Revolution or in the past. So let's talk about the Industrial Revolution. For our leadership models today are predicated on the experiences of over 200 years in the age of machines. And we're going to talk about that a little bit too. And it now colors the way that we look at leadership, not just as leaders, but also as followers. We've been conditioned to believe that there's a certain prototype for a leader, and that's it. And we're in the midst of a transition right now. And so it's very, very confusing as to what the future looks like, because we're kind of 1 foot in each of the worlds, the new world and the old world. And we're not quite there yet. It's kind of like being a Swiss Army knife. You got a lot of tools, and none of them really work very well. Right? But okay, so the age of steam started around 1760, right? Went for about 80 years. And this is the first industrial revolution. And it was the mechanization of what were formerly tasks that were done by craftsmen, right? So this is the age of the cottage industry. There were no factories. In 1760, there were virtually no factories. And people worked at home. They worked on the farm, or they worked, as many of the women and children did, they worked in the home. They would buy raw materials and they would turn them into finished goods and sell them. And that was that's where the term cottage industry came from. Now, by 1760, the technology around the steam engine had been perfected enough so that people were going out and saying, look, I can build these machines powered by steam with using the cotton gin that can now separate seeds from cotton. Don't need people to do that anymore. And using spinning machines that I can now produce large quantities of material in a mechanized process that's going to provide some quality, right? Quality assurance. It's going to be standardized quality. It's going to be faster, greater volume of finished goods. But it's very capital intensive. And so I'm going to spend this money, so very few people could do it. And they had to buy these machines, and they had to open these factories, and they brought people from the countryside into the cities. And now we started bringing people into the cities and working in factories, right? Mostly in the textile industry, but also in transportation, steam engines, trains, boats, telegraph, communications. This was the first industrial revolution. Think of it as the age of steam. The second industrial revolution was the age of electricity, and it was really mass production. And it came on the heels of the first, probably around 1880 through about the Second World War. Think about Edison, the electric light bulb. Think about Henry Ford, the mass production. It's now about, not just about mechanization, but it's about scale. In the first industrial revolution, the workers showed up in service to the machines. In this second industrial revolution, the workers became part of the process. And we started thinking about scientific management. Anybody here of Frederick Winslow Taylor? All right, how about Max Weber? These were the scientific management theorists of the turn of the 20th century who would go out and they would measure the distance between steps, and they would have a stopwatch, and they would figure out the most effective way and the best process for executing efficiency. This was all about efficiency, right? And it was now workers were connected to the process. And it allowed us to create huge amounts of goods, finished goods and services. And I will tell you, it also changed the culture of America. Our culture became a technology-obsessed culture. Every single challenge we had, we were going to solve with technology. That's how we started to fight our wars. We won World War II largely because we could throw more stuff at the other guy than he could throw back at us. And nobody could reach the scale of the United States. There's a great scene, if you've ever seen the movie Patton, where the Germans are talking about, how are we ever going to defeat this? One German field commander says, these people can ship chocolate cakes over from the United States and get them to their soldiers in the field. How are we going to beat a country that can do that? And it was really about the idea that we had the technology and the scale to be able to do that. I mean, we didn't even have to worry about fuel and ammunition. We were now shipping chocolate cakes. It's the American way of doing business as well. It's all about technology. And in my company, we have a saying, technology is really important, but people always get the deciding vote. Right? So think about in your own companies. Every time there's a problem, somebody wants to buy a system to fix it. Right? And some of those problems need to be fixed by human beings, and you can't buy a machine to do it. And I think the machines are really important, but we often skip over the human side because it's really hard. And I think it's partly because we've been so successful. We are prisoners of our own success in that regard. So Andrew Carnegie for U.S. Steel. You got John Rockefeller from Standard Oil. You've got Thomas Edison, the maker, the man who controlled light and actually started GE. You've got Charles Flint from IBM, Henry Ford, and the guy on the end there. Anybody know who that is? Howard Hughes, exactly, right? TWA, Hughes Aircraft, Hughes Aerospace. These were the great leaders. These were the titans of industry. We looked up to them, the heroic leaders, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. They also had a distinct feeling about the relationship between leadership and labor, right? And I love this one, right? It was about paying people. Who's heard of the term $5 a day man? You have. Excellent. Can you tell them about it?
Well,
I don't mean to put you on the spot. If you don't want to, it's okay.
it's a whole organism thing. It's like $5, 8 hours.
Right.
Pay.
Yeah. When Ford opened up his first plant, the prevailing daily wage was $2.50. And he came out and said, I'm going to hire $5 a day men. And everybody was shocked. And he said, I will pay men a living wage. I will pay them well enough so that I will make them as reliable as the machines they operate. And I also believe that it's my business and I'm going to do what I want. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I make the decisions and you do what I say because I pay you $5 a day. So leading in the industrial age kind of looked like that. It was a heroic leadership model. We idealized the men who created these great industries. We looked at them, but it was transactional, right? It's a transactional leadership. It's I pay you. Who's ever seen Mad Men? There's a great scene in there where Peggy comes in and she's all upset because Don Draper won a Clio, right, for an idea that was hers. And she's arguing. She says, it was my idea. And he goes, well, that's what I pay you for. And she said, well, you didn't even say thank you. He goes, well, that's what the money's for, right? You give me ideas and I give you money. That's the transactional nature of leadership. And then it's quid pro quo, this for that, right? The covenant there, though, is that management ideates, management does the thinking, and labor executes. Labor does what it's told. And as long as you're doing that, we're going to pay you. And that's a model. It got us through over 100 years and made us the strongest economy in the world. But it's really all around process, best practice. It's always, and you hear that all the time, the best practice. What's the best practice? But remember, best practice is still past practice. So we should always be aware of the fact that best practice is important, and understanding a best practice in a very simple realm and in simple environment. But as you get more complex in your thinking, best practice is not necessarily where you want to be. And then we talked a little bit about Ford's $5 a day men. So this is the model that grew up out of that, right? And it was, I own the capital, I own the factories, I own everything. You come work for me, I'll pay you well, right? And you know, Karl Marx wrote about alienation and the workers and all of that stuff, and that's what drove us to a 2-day weekend and better pay and better working conditions, because it was the idea that it's still a transactional relationship, but we're going to make it comfortable enough so that you'll stay, right? But we're not going to spend a whole lot of time worrying about if you're self-actualizing. Then we kind of moved into the computer age, right? That first one up there is the ENIAC, right? It was one of the first computers. It was designed to do ballistic solutions for the Army in World War II. Interesting that women are working on it, right? I don't know what happened there, but all of a sudden that kind of changed. If you look down on the lower quarter, that's the IBM punch card system. And then the creation of the microchip. So we went from analog computers to digital computers and speed. So we started making stupid decisions faster because we had computers now to help us do that, right? But here are the heroes and titans of this age, right? And again, they're all still largely men, right? Now that's changing, and I will tell you that Mary Barra in GM is really shaking things up. And so is, I can't remember her first name, but Nuri from Pepsi. She's doing amazing things as well. But, you know, we look at them and it's still very much a heroic model of leadership. You know, Elon Musk and Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs has taken on almost a deity amongst management folks. Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Michael Dell. Michael Dell took his company private because he couldn't transform it. And so he said, I'm just going to take it private so I don't have to answer to shareholders, like what you talked about. By the way, I agree with you. In the world that I hope to live in, the purpose of a company is to serve human beings. Sadly, Michael Dell realized that the purpose of a public company is to return shareholder value. And so he said, I can't operate on the 90-day shot clock. So he bought back his company and transformed it. And he went from making inexpensive laptops to giant cloud computing and servers, and his company is incredibly valuable again. And he said, I like this private company thing a lot. I'm not going back to being a public company. And then, of course, Mark Benioff from Salesforce. So across the spectrum, but we still have this sense of heroic leadership. So what you're seeing, though, is a movement toward a servant type of leadership, where people are saying there's got to be more to being a leader today than just leading a company. It's got to be about people. We're not sure what it's about people yet, but it's about people as well. There is an evolving relationship right now between labor and management. We're really not quite sure where it's going. There's more transparency. People are talking about transparency in the HR world. I know they're talking about pay transparency, and they're talking about all sorts of opening up of the decision making so people can see it. It's still a quid pro quo. We still hire people and we largely manage them by compensation. But there is an emerging transparency that I talked about. That covenant, it's kind of evolving right now, but we still focus on process and best practice. I go to conference after conference after conference on process of improvement. Lean, Six Sigma, all good. I'm not knocking that at all. But it is no longer going to drive the kind of competitive advantage that it once did, right? Because you've largely gotten most of the efficiency you're going to get out of all of our systems, and any more that you get is going to be driven by technology. So where does that leave us in the digital age, or in the fourth industrial revolution, right? So the first one was steam, the second one was electricity, the third one was the microchip or information, right, which is still in that transition period. But now we're moving into an age where there's this dystopian view of the future about the singularity, right? When machines become sentient and they take over and they're going to run everything and we're all going to be out of work, no one's going to have a job, and we're going to have to, welcome our robot overlords. My son said that to me one time. He said, I, for one, welcome our robot overlords. I shook my head. But I'll tell you, there's another vision on this, and it's called the multiplicity, right? And it's the world in which humans and machines work together. It's already happening. In hospitals today, a pharmacist will dispense an order, several orders to go out to patients and put them on a robot, and that robot will deliver them through the hospital, right? Happens all the time. In many warehouses, they operate in the dark because they don't need lights because they're robotic. And the robots bring the section over to the human who then pulls off the part that needs to go out for shipping and puts it somewhere. So that's already happening today. There are, as we talk about artificial intelligence and we talk about the ability to make decisions, that's already happening today as well. Traders no longer, algorithms now run trading houses. Right? The day-to-day stock trades that used to be done by people are now done by machines because it happens too fast and human beings can't make those decisions fast enough. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people who work in trading houses anymore. It's just different kind of work. So what's the future for leadership in a world where a machine can make a decision better than a CEO? Because we always hear about how machines are going to take blue-collar workers out of the mix, but we never hear it about management. But there are machines right now that can make decisions that are being made by managers. And eventually they will be, because those decisions are going to be so complex and they're going to happen so fast that they're going to be machine-abled, right? And certainly the human will always get the right to override. But as we get used to that, you're going to see less and less humans intervening in the decisions that are being made by machines. So if I'm a leader and I run this company, I'm the CEO, or I'm a chief operating officer, or I'm a president of North American business unit, or I'm a manager of a field sales office, and I am no longer the primary decision maker, what do I do? What's my role? Anybody got any thoughts? If you're the chief human resources officer of a company and you're not making those decisions anymore, what do you do?
It gets back to inspiration and culture.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. Those soft skills are what's going to be really important because ultimately people don't want to work for machines. They want to work for human beings. And I don't believe that'll ever change because even a machine that's programmed to have a human response still isn't a human. And we respond to human beings. So there will be a role for leaders, but that role is going to be very different. And it's going to be about, if there are competencies of leadership, and some people say there's 5, and some people say there's 7, and some people say there's 10, and it depends on who you read, but there's generally an accepted group that goes something like this. Communicating, connecting, emotional intelligence, constant learning, humility, functional expertise, right? Something along those lines. You can add or pull in a few others, depends on who you are and what your perspective is, but almost always functional expertise in there, and functional expertise is shrinking. The higher you go in the organization, the more it shrinks. That's true today, and it's becoming even more true. And those others become even more important. The ability, so I do network theory, right? It's part of the other work that I did when I was in the service, right? I'm more of a student or a practitioner than I am a student. But if you are operating in a network and you're leading in a network, your job is to make connections. That's your job, right? To be able to see, to have the vision, to figure out where the organization is going to go, to understand the unique role and contribution that each group or each cluster or each hub maintains in that network, and to be able to make sure that they're connecting in the right ways at the right times.